Hi, everybody. Thank you so much. Thank you, Brent. Thank you, Russ, for having me. That introduction was like a little bit of a voyage into the horrors of initially setting up a Google alert for Derek Thompson 7 years ago and getting so many updates about horse racing and soap opera acting. It's really an honor to be here. In many ways, the Bay Area is the birthplace of abundance as an idea, and I mean that in several dimensions. I mean it in a critical way, and I mean it in a positive way. In the critical sense, the Bay Area and California broadly is a birthplace of abundance because it's ground zero for many of the problems that abundance seeks to address. Restrictive rules and jealous attitudes that get in the way of housing supply, a disconnect between impressive announcements about building infrastructure like high-speed rail and significantly less facts about it not being built, and a disconnect between environmental ideals and not so environmental outcomes, like a stubborn resistance to dense home building, which is environmentally friendly, and clean energy deployment, where California has fallen behind Texas. But California didn't just inspire abundance by the negative example that it sent. I think it also inspired abundance by the positive example that it sent. When I fly from Washington, D.C., which I love, to Silicon Valley or San Francisco or Los Angeles, where my sister lives, I can never shake the sense that I'm traveling to a frontier of technology or of storytelling, a frontier of some kind of definite optimism. And so one thing that I love about visiting this part of the country is this sense that the people here want to work on work that's about the future and want to work on projects whose ultimate impact will reverberate beyond this zip code, this state. They want to invent cures for the world. They want to invent social networks for the world. They want to build tools for the world. And while I like some of the cures more than I like some of the social networks or some of the tools that they build, I admire this perspective toward growth. So California, I think it is fair to say, and Silicon Valley in particular, San Jose in particular, has inspired abundance both by its failures and its promise. Much of the speech is going to criticize policies that have created and threatened to create a crisis in this space. But I want to commend this audience for being here, for taking data seriously, for taking criticism seriously, for listening to criticism, and above all, maybe for thinking broadly about solving the problems of not just this narrow zip code, but this region, this state, and this country. And that was unbelievably exquisite timing, given that this is the exact moment that I had to start using the slides. So thank you for that timely handoff. So several years ago, where are we in the slides, by the way? Is there a place? Okay, it's up there? Great. Several years ago, I was struggling to write a book about progress and themes of scientific and technological development. This book was going absolutely horribly. It was one of the worst 3 months of my professional career. I hated writing this book. And I came back to the Atlantic, and I was trying to adopt some ideas that had been bubbling around in my head about the history of scientific and technological progress. I come back to the Atlantic to pick up the story. I come back to the Atlantic, and I'm trying to adapt some of these ideas from my 3 months off writing this book about the history of technological progress. And one of the ideas that I was most interested in is this distinction between invention and implementation. That I think sometimes people who write stories about how the world moves forward, they only focus on the moment of invention, the so-called light bulb moment. But if you just focus on these light bulb moments where something is invented, often you miss the larger story. You miss how the technology is implemented, how it's actually built. So for example, if you invent, say, the smallpox vaccine in 1796, and it inoculates a young 8-year-old boy named James Phipps, that's a breakthrough moment in the history of medicine, maybe one of the most important moments in the history of medicine, the first vaccine to cure the worst disease in human history. But it doesn't actually matter to humanity if you vaccinated one person. What matters is whether you can scale that vaccine, whether you can vaccinate all of Europe, all of America, all of Africa. And it was that latter story of implementation that actually changed the world. And so I was sort of buzzing around with this idea, the distinction between what we invent, what we make possible to build, and what we actually build. And my friend Ezra Klein wrote this wonderful story about an idea that he called supply-side progressivism. He said in many cases, the Democratic Party in the last 50 years has been very, very talented at working on the demand side of the ledger. That is to say, to tax progressively, and then to redistribute taxed income to help raise up the living standards of the poor and reduce the poverty level. And this is a mitzvah. This is a wonderful thing to do. But while Democrats had focused so cleanly on the demand side of the ledger, they had forgotten about the supply side of the ledger. That is, not only how do you spend money, but how do you build things? And in the last 50 years, in fact, it was many blue cities and blue states that had gotten the worst at building the things that Americans most need, things like housing and infrastructure, transportation, and clean energy. And I read this essay, and I was made immediately and instantly jealous by it. And I thought, I got to one-up him. Like, what can I possibly do to get back at them? And so I wrote this idea that I called the abundance agenda. And this idea was inspired by this moment where I was standing in line waiting for a COVID test in Washington, D.C., and it was about 25 degrees outside, and I was absolutely freezing. And I thought, it's just ridiculous that at this point in 2022, we're 2 years into a pandemic, and we have a shortage of COVID tests, such that people have to queue around the block in order to get their rationed COVID tests. And as I thought about the general concept of scarcity and shortages in the pandemic, I thought, it's not just COVID tests. It's the COVID vaccine, which we had a shortage of. It's masks that in March 2020, you had doctors and Fauci essentially begging people to not wear masks because we didn't have enough to go to the doctors. And then as I thought about it more, I said, scarcity and shortages, these aren't just a story of the pandemic and COVID. This is really a story of the 21st century in America. We have a shortage of housing. We have a shortage of clean energy. And in many cases, these shortages are not created by our inability to invent something, but rather, and here I click back to this idea that I had been struggling with in that initial book, not about our ability to invent the concept of a house, but our ability to build that which we knew how to invent. We know how to put up walls, we know how to install elevators, but in some cases, it is all too human rules that get in the way of implementing that which we know how to build. And so I came up with this idea called the abundance agenda. And I said, I want the abundance agenda to do three things. I wanted to sort of combine three different ideologies. I wanted to take the left's emphasis on human welfare, safe living spaces, and excellent government services, and fantastic living conditions, and broadly shared wealth. And then finally, for my libertarian friends, I was attracted to their obsession with finding bad rules that get in the way of the common good. And I thought, is there some way to develop an ideology that's sort of like a flux capacitor, a sort of combined triptych of these three ideas? Right, the left's influence or the left's emphasis on human welfare, the right's influence on national greatness, and the libertarians' emphasis on taking out bad rules that get in the way of the common good. And then that came together in this book, Abundance, that I was so proud to write with Ezra. As we settled into our reporting, I think it's very fair to say that we became mildly scandalized by what we learned in our reporting. Lots of ideas that seemed to be exceptions to the rule turned out to be, in fact, the common rule. So, for example, we thought if housing is a progressive priority, why is it so often blue cities and blue states that have the worst time building homes and where the homeless rates are the highest? And in fact, homeless rates are highest in 5 states all governed by Democratic governors right now. If climate change is a progressive priority, why has Texas led the nation in solar and wind additions while blue states often lag so far behind? Another theme that emerged in our reporting is that for decades, it seemed like Democrats had learned to associate success with how much spending they could announce, how much spending they could authorize, rather than how much they built with the money they bragged about authorizing. That's how you got California approving $33 billion for a high-speed rail system that does not exist, as you can see in this picture, that is not of a high-speed rail system, but is rather of a kind of empty tunnel. You can see it in New York City's construction norms, where a sort of a phalanx of complacency, public union laws, and rules that get in the way of fast and cheap building have conspired to make the Long Island Railroad home to the world's most expensive mile of subway track on the planet. You can see it in San Francisco's procedural kludge, which somehow drove the cost of building a public toilet in downtown San Francisco up to $1.7 million, which would be a completely fair price to pay for a public toilet if it, like the toilet you can see in this slide, were made out of pure gold. But it is not made out of pure gold. It's made out of incredibly boring porcelain, and yet it somehow cost $1.7 million, the most expensive porcelain in the world. Or you look at Chicago's mayor bragging that his city invested $11 billion in contracting to build 10,000 affordable housing units, which, if you do the quick math, means that the city of Chicago is spending $1.1 million per affordable housing unit in a city where the average housing price is about half of that. Or it's billions authorized under Biden's electrical vehicle charging station plan that simply weren't built. Billions more authorized for rural broadband that simply wasn't built. Or you look at the fact that the U.S. struggles to build military technology like submarines on time and under budget at a time when China's shipbuilding capacity is several orders of magnitude larger than America's, and its Navy is on track to be 50% larger than the U.S. Navy by 2030. Our feeling is that if Democrats want to represent the coalition that believes in government, they need government to build what it says it's going to build and does what it says it's going to do. I have this conversation often with my friends on the left, including a conversation I had with the mayor of New York, Zoran Mamdani, the Democratic Socialist. And one way that we put it in our 35-minute talk is I said, if people on the left, the progressives, are going to ask the government, or excuse me, if they're going to ask the public to allow the government to add additional functions, they had damn well better prove that government can function in the first place. The best advertisement for adding new government functions is proof that government can function in the first place. If we don't do this, I think, if Democrats fail in this task, we can't hold it against voters to assume that they have to vote for the alternative party. So what is abundance? In the very first page of this book, we say that to have the future we want, we need to build and invent more of what we need. This is a short book. It's only about 220 pages long, and there's a couple reasons why it's short. Reason number one, practically, is that we were very busy, and so we didn't have time to write a longer book. Reason number two, which might be more to the point substantive, is that we wanted to focus the book on goods that were good for everyone, what some people call public goods, on goods that maybe economists would say have positive externalities. Housing, energy, good governance, scientific breakthroughs, technological developments that make people's lives better. Those are the 5 main chapters of the book because we think those are foundational goods, goods that are good for everyone. Housing is not a special interest, at least it should not be. Energy is not a group. The more electricity you build, the cheaper it is, the easier it is to build technologies that use electricity that make our lives easier. Scientific breakthroughs, which I'm not going to talk about as much in this speech, are, I think, particularly important because when you invent a vaccine and you give it to someone, you're not, if you have an abundance of medicine, taking that cure away from someone else. In fact, by inoculating that individual, you're protecting the people around them. So that's why we focused on these 5 foundational goods. They are goods whose good spills over when you choose to build more of them. I want to talk a little bit first about housing because I think that is maybe the most important issue to this particular zip code. I want to start by taking you to Lakewood, California in the year 1950. After World War II, millions of veterans were returning home from the European and Pacific theaters, and they were starting families, and young parents were balancing babies in their arms, scouring the country looking for houses. And no suburban development in the country epitomized this era more than Lakewood, a planned community built on open farmland just north of Long Beach. Between 1950 and 1953, more than 17,000 homes were built in Lakewood, California. At its most furious pace, the city's builders were finishing a new home once every 7.5 minutes. And the houses sold almost as fast as they were built. At the grand opening in March 1953, 30,000 people lined up to check out the inventory. Like, imagine 30,000 people lining up to check out a new city created in California. And Lakewood, which just 4 years earlier had essentially just been a sparse farmland of sugar beets and lima beans, was transformed into California's 19th largest city. This story epitomizes what was known at the time as the growth machine of the 20th century, this unrelenting building up of cities and bridges and infrastructure. And this was an amazing moment for the country if what you wanted was growth. But there was a reaction to the growth machine. There was a reaction in Washington State and in Vermont and in Massachusetts, and nowhere was there more of a reaction to this growth machine than in California. And it was epitomized by another city a few hundred miles north of Lakewood. This is Petaluma. It's nestled in the windy hills north of San Francisco. I love Petaluma for their Pinot Noirs. Maybe other people know the Petaluma Gap for precisely this reason, but I've been told in speeches not to belabor this particular subject. especially, I suppose, at 11:55 in the morning. Petaluma also saw its population boom after the war. But unlike Lakewood, Petaluma became famous not for welcoming growth, but for stopping it. In 1971, Petaluma became famous for introducing one of the state's first growth plans. It capped new housing additions at 500 per year and added a boundary to prevent sprawl. And once that formula for reducing housing growth and reducing population growth was legally approved, other cities scrambled to build their own quota systems and permitting regimes. Today, I think it is very safe to say that California writ large, and especially Northern California, is much more Petaluma than it is Lakewood. Housing permits have fallen and fallen in the state's most popular cities. In Los Angeles, fewer homes were built in the 1970s than the 1960s. Fewer were built in the 1980s than 1970s, which sounds pretty bad, except fewer homes were built in the 1990s than the 1980s, and fewer homes built in the 2000s on a per capita basis than the 1990s. In the early 2020s, with home prices at record levels, I think the Petaluma plan reached its logical endpoint when, for the first time in the history of the state, California, which as late as the 1960s was growing twice as fast as the rest of the country, for the first time, the population of California shrank. Now, what I'm describing here is definitely not just a Democratic phenomenon. And I want to make that very, very clear. There are a lot of Republican NIMBYs, not just in San Jose, not just in the Bay Area, but around the country. But some of this problem, Ezra and I found, is a problem of modern liberalism. Blue cities are laden with more rules and more litigation procedures that block new housing and transit construction. Maybe the single most powerful statistic here comes from my former colleague at The Atlantic, Yoni Applebaum, who noted that in California cities, where the share of progressive votes goes up by 10 points, the number of housing permits issued on average declines by 30 points. As the cost of living rises in these states, tens of thousands of families are leaving them, which means the left isn't just losing people, they're losing an argument. Democrats have become, or are at risk of becoming, the coalition of kindness is everything signs in front yards, zoned for single-family houses. There's a line that Ezra used a lot in our book tour that now I have the privilege of being able to steal in his absence, which is that liberals should be able to say vote for Democrats will turn America into California. But instead, with the state's infamously high cost of living and stark homelessness crisis, it is conservatives who can proudly say vote for Democrats, they'll turn America into California. And I think that in places where Democrats hold the most power, liberal governance must be an advertisement for itself and not a brochure for the opposition. The reason that I think housing is so fundamental, and the reason that I spend so much time on it, is that you hear a lot right now in politics, and especially from Democrats, including Spamberger's response to the State of the Union just a few days ago, about affordability, affordability, affordability. And in fact, if you asked people who switched from the Democratic column in 2020 to the Republican column in 2024, why did you switch parties? The answers tended to be cost of living, inflation, and maybe at number 3 you'd hear housing. But the point that I want to make with what I'm about to say and with the graph you can see on this screen is that when people say that the problem is cost of living and inflation and housing, what they're really saying is housing and housing and housing. Because if you look at how people spend their money by age, at every single age level, the cost of housing swamps the cost of transportation and the cost of food and the cost of healthcare and the cost of pensions and Social Security and DoorDash and whatever else, Netflix. Affordability is a housing story. Cost of living is a housing story. And inflation has been a housing story. And in fact, according to pollsters that I speak with, whereas several years ago, if you asked Americans about the most important policy issues in the country, housing used to be in the 20s. Today, if you ask voters under 40, what's the most important issue in the country, housing is now in the top 2 or the top 3. One way to conceptualize that among an audience that might not be median age under 40 is that housing is, for voters under 40, what Social Security is for voters over 65. It is the issue around which every other issue can hang. So I want to spend a little bit of time, actually just two more pictures here that I think are really interesting, to get a sense of how this is not just a California story, but a national story. The Joint Center for Housing Studies at Harvard University looks at the share of housing prices as a share of income. So if the average house in an area is 2 to 3 times the average income in the area, in this picture you can see that area will be shaded in blue or light blue. And this is a picture from 1980, when in fact in most places in America, right, the typical price to income ratio was about 2 or 3. 22 years later, you see that the map has been entirely repainted, and that housing has become about 2 to 3 times more expensive, even adjusting for income. And this is like a bit of a wonky debate, and I sometimes regret heading down this cul-de-sac. But the major point here is that you'll sometimes hear from, let's call them economic optimists, that Americans are richer than ever. And we are. GDP has grown and grown. Median incomes and real incomes have grown and grown. Americans in the 2020s are much richer than Americans in the 1980s, and you shouldn't listen to anybody who pretends otherwise. The problem, as these graphs show, is that housing has gotten more expensive faster than Americans have gotten richer. And that means that even in a country where the average American is getting richer and richer decade after decade, he or she isn't feeling it. Because when they look at what they have left over after they spend on rent or mortgage, they're left with less and less. I want to spend a little bit of time on environmentalism, because I think in many ways, the story of America in the last 100 years, the story of American policy, can be told in the story of Americans' relationship to the natural world. And I know that sounds like a big braggadocious statement, but I really do think that we can understand a lot about how we got to here by seeing our relationship with the environment change in the last 120 years. And I call this part of the talk, and we call this part of the book, the 3 eras of environmentalism. The first era of environmentalism I want to talk about is the early 1900s, the early 20th century. In the 19th century, there was really no modern, mainstream concept of environmentalism in America. It was really Teddy Roosevelt and John Muir who thought, we have, especially in California, here in Yosemite, in Yellowstone, we have some of the most beautiful places in the world. And right now, 19th century industry is running roughshod across the country. What we need to do is take a map of America and draw circles around the most beautiful places. And we have to make it a matter of national law that says that industry cannot penetrate into those circles. And so with this, we created the national parks, and the national parks were an absolutely extraordinary achievement, one of the best ideas in American history. The problem is, it wasn't enough. Because if you move to the 1950s and 1960s, pollution was running rampant across America, far outside of the circles that we had drawn in the map. Here you can see the cities of Ohio lighting on fire. In New Hampshire, the rivers would run red and purple and blue based on the color of the textiles that was being dumped into them. In Los Angeles, the 1940s, residents woke up to smog that was so thick it was broadly thought that the Japanese had launched a chemical attack on the city of Los Angeles. They were wrong. Industry, Los Angeles had launched a chemical attack against itself. It was not uncommon for dozens of people to die of pollution every single month in New York City in the 1940s and 1950s. The America of the 1940s and 1950s, what I previously called the growth machine, was absolutely disgusting. It was completely disgusting. And so we responded to the rise of industry and the rise of pollution that wasn't fixed by the first age of environmentalism by creating a second age of environmentalism. Not the age of conservation, but the age of regulation. We passed the Clean Air Act. We passed the Clean Water Act. We passed NEPA. We found acts and passed acts to protect migratory bird species and endangered species. These laws succeeded. The water we drink is cleaner. The air we breathe is cleaner. The world we live in is blessed by this era of environmentalism, by this era of regulation. But a theme of history and a theme of our book is that sometimes the proper diagnosis for the diseases of the past can become the diseases of the present. We created a set of laws in the 1960s and 1970s that successfully stopped industry from polluting America. But the problem is a lot of those laws grew into phenomena that stopped the modern world from being able to build anything, even when those things are good for the environment. So today, NEPA and other environmental laws are often used to stop the construction of urban housing, to stop the construction of solar panels, to stop the construction of new batteries and wind turbines. And so this is the problem of the moment. It's not just that we were successful in cleaning the planet in the 1970s. We were, in a way, catastrophically successful at holding back our ability to build today what we most need. And that's why this book asks us to enter into a third era of environmentalism. Just as regulation was necessary to replace the era of conservation, we need a new synthesis, a new understanding of environmentalism to replace the era of regulation that merely stopped things from being built that we need. I think it's really important to say here that, the past is not our enemy. The past is not our enemy. We can't just look back and say, we have to tear up the laws of the 1970s. We have to recognize what these laws gave us. The air that we breathe when we criticize the laws of the 1970s is made cleaner by their success. But at the same time, if we recognize the true environmental challenge of the moment, that challenge is climate change. And there's really only two ways that you can solve the problem of climate change. You can ask voters to essentially accept less, to enter into a degrowth paradigm, where you simply say you have to accept more expensive energy, we're going to have to make do with less, or you say we're going to continue to try to grow, but we're going to grow cleaner. And in order to grow cleaner, we have to build new things. We have to build new clean energy. And building these projects might sometimes require us to resolve and amend the laws that we wrote 50 and 60 years ago. I know that today, California Senators Buffy Wicks and Scott Wiener are absolutely all over this project. Gavin Newsom signed several laws that now make it easier to build downtown housing and clean energy in California. That's a really, really important first step. And it's my hope that that's the beginning of the turning of a page, right? That the same way that we knew we had to turn a page in the 1960s to enter into a new era of environmentalism then, we recognize today that we need a new paradigm to solve the problems of the present. I want to end with a couple stories that sort of loop back to the sort of bad haiku that you can see here on this screen. And for those maybe watching who can't see this haiku, I'll just read it to you in a non-poetic voice. It says, "Growth is good, change is hard, both are true, and stasis sucks." And I really powerfully believe all four of these three-word lines. Growth is good. Growth is good. And we know that. The opposite of growth is recession, and nobody roots for it. But let's not kid ourselves. Change is hard. There are some reasonable reasons why people fear change, whether it's construction at the local level or the development of technology at the national level. Both these things are true at the same time, but we have to recognize that the opposite of growth is something that all of us deep down fear and don't want in our lives. And there's two stories I think that really hammer home this small poem, "Growth is good, change is hard, both are true, and stasis sucks." The first story is I was in Montana last year, and I was giving a talk at the Montana Festival, and that's in Bozeman, Montana, beautiful place. And the night before this speech, I was talking to some of the local representatives, some of the local politicians there. And a state senator pulled me aside, and she said, Derek, I want you to know that I like this project of abundance. I think it's interesting. But I really, really don't want Bozeman to turn into Salt Lake City. And I said, you mean like a potential ecological disaster, or how do you mean? She said, no, I don't want it to turn into a city at all. I want Bozeman to remain the size that it is. And I'm not the kind of person who wants to immediately jump down someone else's throat when they just, said that they're kind of interested in my work. And so I didn't say anything in the moment. I just stayed quiet and then, got another drink at the bar. And then later that night, sipping maybe my third drink of the night, I heard the mayor of Bozeman, Terry Cunningham, make a really interesting point. He said, I'm incredibly proud that Gallatin County, in which Bozeman sits, is responsible for 30% of job creation in the state of Montana over the last few years. Hoops and hollers, everybody's screaming, everybody's clapping, even the state senator, who just told me she fears Bozeman becoming a city, applauding enthusiastically. I thought for a moment, that's weird. That's really interesting. Because if somebody says, Bozeman is adding jobs at a furious pace, it's an applause line. But if somebody says Bozeman needs to add housing at a furious pace, it's a boo line. Which is funny, because one of the things about people who get jobs, they sometimes enjoy living in a house. That's a laugh line, but it's a simplistic way to make what I think is a deeper point, which is that many people's hearts are split on this issue. They're not anti-growth or pro-growth. They are both at the same time. And you can activate a different aspect of their heart based on how you frame the quality of growth. People root for jobs and fear housing additions, but can be made to understand that it is inevitable that if an area grows in jobs, it must grow in housing. Otherwise, it is forcing the people doing those valuable jobs to live a zillion miles away. The point here, again, is not that people are hypocrites, but rather that we live with complicated truths that disagree with each other. And one of my jobs, one of the jobs of abundance liberalism, one of the jobs I hope of people in this room, is not to make people believe that they're wrong, not to prove to people that they're wrong, but rather in a strange way to help them realize that they might have agreed with you all along because they want job growth as much as you want job growth. They just haven't made that next connection that people who work in jobs also live in housing. The last story here is 2 years ago. I was having a conversation with a family friend who lives in Beverly Hills. And, we were talking about how he thought housing development could just be a mess. And just down the street, he said, there is a new development that is causing all of this construction mayhem, and there's detours now around the roads that he was used to driving home. And it's just an enormous headache. Beverly Hills, this is for single-family houses, beautiful single-family houses, detached. I don't know what we're doing with this large monstrosity down the road. It's none of my concern. It's nothing I'm interested in. And again, he was serving me a Caymus wine, which is delicious. And for some reason, I'm always having conversations about housing development while drinking something and just not saying anything in the hopes that the person who's plying me with alcohol will keep it coming. And so I didn't say anything at the moment that was directly critical of that statement. Instead, I was a little bit rude. I said, how's your son's home search in Los Angeles going? And he said, it's terrible. There's nowhere for him to live. And again, that's a laugh line, but I hope you hear that it's a cheap laugh line that sits on top of a deeper truth. People have a different relationship with the concept of housing construction than they have with the concept of hoping my family lives near me. If you ask people, do you want your children to be able to grow, to live next to you when they get a job and finish college? I think a lot of parents who don't hate their children say yes. When you ask, do you want to see your grandchildren more than once a year, I think a lot of grandparents who don't hate their grandchildren say yes. And so in a way, if you frame these discussions purely on the cold, material, statistical, economic fact of local housing additions, you'll get one reaction. But instead, if you frame this as, do you want to support a set of policies that requires your grandchildren to take a 7-hour connecting flight in order to see you, you'll have a very different answer. I don't think these people, my friend in Beverly Hills, my friends in Bozeman, they're not hypocrites. They're not bad people. They're not unreasonable people. They're people who can be reasoned with. And I want to reason with them. I want to find ways to frame these issues so that when people see houses, they don't think detours, construction, loud noises. Although, yes, I understand construction can be loud and involve detours. I want them to think jobs, growth, babies bouncing on my knee every week and not just every other year, because the connecting flight through Phoenix can often take a while to get to Los Angeles. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for the work that you do. And thank you so much for, I hope, recognizing that a place like San Jose, a place like the Valley, the larger Bay Area, this is a birthplace of abundance in two ways. It's a birthplace of abundance because of the scale of problems that exist here. But I do believe that this place is beginning to turn that page into a third era. And I hope that this book and the concept of abundance can move that hand along in turning the page. So thank you very much.